Hey everyone, thank you all so much for the incredible support on this channel. It genuinely means the world to me. If you're enjoying the content, hitting that subscribe button helps us get closer to our goal of 10k subscribers by next year. And don't forget, your likes and comments help YouTube share our videos with more awesome people like you. Now, let's dive into today's video. The first time Dr. Eleanor Wright noticed something was wrong, she was reviewing routine telescope data at 3:48 a.m. in her cramped office at the Mountain View Observatory. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed, transfixed by the images on her monitor. Something about the Carina Nebula looked off. She'd been studying this particular region of space for over 15 years, documenting stellar formations and patterns. The nebula was as familiar to her as her own backyard. But now, there was a perfect circle of nothing, where thousands of stars should have been twinkling. At first, she assumed it was an equipment malfunction. Digital artifacts weren't uncommon, especially when dealing with long-exposure photographs of deep space. She ran the standard diagnostics, recalibrated the telescope's settings, and took another set of images. The void was still there. "Hey Mike," she called out to her research assistant, who was dozing in the break room. "Can you come take a look at this?" Mike Thompson stumbled in, his glasses askew and dark circles under his eyes. At 26, he was barely out of graduate school, but his keen eye for detail had made him invaluable to the department. "What's up, Dr. Wright?" She pointed to the monitor. "Tell me what you see here." Mike leaned in, squinting at the image. His drowsiness evaporated instantly. That's not possible." "So you see it too?" "It's like someone took an eraser to the stars." Mike adjusted his glasses. "Perfect circle, absolute darkness, no background radiation, no light scatter, nothing." Eleanor nodded grimly. "I'm going to send this to some colleagues. Can you start compiling historical images of this region? I want to know if there's any precedent for this kind of phenomenon." Over the next few hours, responses began flooding in from observatories around the world. The void was real, and it was growing. The Keck Observatory in Hawaii confirmed the observation. So did the Very Large Telescope in Chile. Every major astronomical facility that could point their equipment at that patch of sky saw the same thing. A perfect sphere of absolute darkness, expanding through space, consuming stars like a cosmic eraser. The scientific community's initial response was skepticism. Dark nebulae weren't uncommon, and there were several known phenomena that could account for localized absence of visible light. But Dr. Wright knew this was different. The edges of the void were too perfect, too precise, and it was expanding at a measurable rate. She spent the next 3 days, without sleep, documenting every aspect of the phenomenon. The void was growing exponentially, doubling in size approximately every 47 hours. At this rate, it would engulf the entire Carina Nebula within weeks. But what troubled her most wasn't the void's expansion, it was its perfection. Nature didn't create perfect circles. Whatever this was, it had to be artificial. The implications of that thought kept her awake long after exhaustion should have claimed her. On the fourth day, as she was preparing a preliminary paper on the phenomenon, Mike burst into her office without knocking. His face was pale, his tablet shaking in his hands. "Dr. Wright," he stammered, "you need to see this. It's happening again." 2 more voids just appeared. She grabbed the tablet. The images showed 2 more perfect spheres of darkness, one in the Andromeda Galaxy, another in the Pleiades cluster. 3 independent phenomena, identical in nature, appearing within days of each other. "This isn't random," she whispered, more to herself than to Mike. "This is coordinated." As she stared at the images, a terrible thought occurred to her. If these voids were artificial, created by some intelligence, then they weren't just observing a phenomenon. They were witnessing an action, a deliberate process. The real question wasn't what was causing the voids. The real question was, why? The discovery of multiple voids sent shockwaves through the astronomical community. Within 2 weeks, research teams had identified 17 distinct spheres of darkness across the observable universe, each expanding at precisely the same rate. The mathematical precision was undeniable. These weren't natural phenomena. Dr. Wright's office had become a command center of sorts, walls covered with star charts and time-lapse projections. She'd barely left the observatory, surviving on vending machine coffee and whatever food Mike remembered to bring her. The dark circles under her eyes had become a permanent feature, but she couldn't stop. Not when she was starting to see the pattern. "Look at this," she said to Dr. Thomas Blackwood, her former mentor who'd flown in from Cambridge after reading her preliminary findings. She pointed to a holographic projection of the known voids. "They're not random, the spacing between them. It's deliberate." Thomas adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, studying the projection. "Some kind of geometric pattern." More than that, Eleanor manipulated the display, connecting the voids with glowing lines. "They're forming a lattice structure, like a net." "A net?" Mike looked up from his data terminal. "What would be the purpose of—" He was interrupted by a blaring alarm from his computer. "New void detected. This one's closer, much closer, outer edge of the Virgo supercluster." Eleanor felt her blood run cold. The Virgo supercluster contained the local group, their cosmic neighborhood. The phenomenon was no longer just affecting distant galaxies. It was getting closer. Over the next few days, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The voids were indeed forming a vast, three-dimensional lattice across space. Each new void appeared at precisely calculated points, expanding until it connected with its neighbors. The effect was like watching a cosmic spiderweb being woven by an unseen hand. But it was the deep space probes that provided the most terrifying data. Voyager 3, humanity's most distant messenger, sent back readings that defied physics as they understood it. The void wasn't just an absence of light, it was an absence of everything. Space itself seemed to stop at the boundary. The last transmission from Voyager 3 came at 2:36 p.m. on a Tuesday. Primary sensors detect mass displacement beyond calculated parameters. Gravity readings, inconsistent with known physics. Detecting movement of data corruption, scale beyond previous records. Boundary approaching at data corruption kilometers per second. Final transmission, something vast moves in the deal. The probe went silent, mid-sentence. Every probe that encountered a void boundary met the same fate. Eleanor spent countless hours analyzing the final transmissions. The probe's instruments had detected something massive moving through space, something larger than anything humans had ever documented. The voids weren't just empty spaces, they were more like holes. Holes being deliberately punched in the fabric of space-time. But it was the gravitational readings that truly terrified her. According to the data, space itself was being manipulated on a scale that made stellar engineering look like child's play. Whatever was creating these voids had mastery over the fundamental forces of the universe. "Dr. Wright," Mike called out one evening, his voice trembling. "I've been running projections on the void expansion patterns, based on their current rate and distribution." "How long?" she asked, already dreading the answer. "At current rates, they'll reach our solar system in less than 3 months." Eleanor stared at the star charts, at the growing web of darkness spreading across the cosmos. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider a terrifying possibility. What if this wasn't just an astronomical phenomenon? What if this was a process, a deliberate restructuring of space itself? And most importantly, what would happen when the darkness finally reached Earth? They lost contact with Kepler 186f first. The distant human outpost, established just 5 years earlier, simply went dark mid-transmission. Their final message contained nothing alarming, just routine atmospheric readings and a request for more entertainment downloads for the crew. The loss of a single outpost could be explained away. Equipment failure, solar flares, any number of natural phenomena. But then Europa Station went silent. Then the Mars colonies. One by one, humanity's furthest reaches fell silent, each going dark with the same eerie lack of warning or distress signals. Dr. Wright stood before the United Nations Space Committee, her hands steady despite her exhaustion. The chamber was packed, not just with delegates, but with military leaders and heads of state. This wasn't just a scientific briefing anymore. This was a crisis meeting. "The pattern is undeniable," she explained, gesturing to the holographic display behind her. "Each void is creating what we're calling a dead zone around its perimeter. No signals can penetrate it, no probes can survive it, and they're expanding faster than we initially calculated." A delegate from India raised his hand. "Dr. Wright, are you suggesting these phenomena are intentional?" "I'm not suggesting anymore. I'm stating it as fact." She pulled up the latest images from the James Webb Space Telescope. "Look at this time lapse. The voids aren't just expanding, they're moving, changing direction, responding to each other. This is coordinated activity on a cosmic scale." The room erupted in murmurs. Eleanor continued, her voice cutting through the noise. "But there's something else, something we just discovered." She hesitated, knowing how this would sound. "The stars, they're not just being hidden by the voids. They're being removed, extracted from space-time itself." The Webb telescope's final images, before it went dark, showed entire galaxies being systematically dismantled. Stars weren't just disappearing into the darkness. They were being plucked out of existence with surgical precision. Back at Mountain View Observatory, the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Animals began acting strangely, migratory birds flying in confused circles, whales beaching themselves in record numbers, even domestic pets showing signs of increasing anxiety. Dr. Thomas Blackwood had developed a theory about this. "It's the gravitational changes," he explained during one of their late-night research sessions. "Animals are more sensitive to these fundamental forces than we are. They can feel what's coming." "And what exactly is coming, Thomas?" Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Before he could respond, Mike burst into the room. "You need to see this," he said, pulling up a live feed from their main telescope. The image showed their own solar system's outer edges, where there should have been a scattered field of distant stars. There was now something else, something that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. A wall of absolute darkness was approaching, moving faster than anything they'd previously observed. But this wasn't like the other voids. This was different. This was larger, more complex, and it was headed straight for them. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mike's fingers flew over his keyboard. "At current velocity, less than 2 weeks before it reaches Pluto's orbit." Eleanor stared at the approaching darkness, understanding flooding through her. "We're not just observing anymore," she said. "We're being targeted. Whatever this is, it's coming for us specifically." That night, as she looked up at the sky, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The stars were dimmer than they should have been. Not all at once, and not dramatically, but enough that she could tell. It was starting. The stars were going out, not with a bang, not with any drama, but quietly, methodically, one by one. And there wasn't a damn thing humanity could do about it. The message came from the Oort Cloud research station at 11:42 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. Dr. Eleanor Wright was reviewing satellite data when Mike's urgent voice crackled over the intercom. "Dr. Wright, they're broadcasting on all frequencies. Everyone needs to hear this." The transmission was garbled, distorted by interference unlike anything they'd encountered before. But through the static, words emerged. "This is Dr. Patel at Oort Cloud Station. We're seeing, God help us, we're seeing something impossible. The void isn't empty. There's something in there. Something moving. It's vast, larger than anything we've ever... Wait. The sensors are picking up. It's a structure. A geometric pattern repeating infinitely in all directions. It's like looking at the blueprint of reality itself." Static overtook the transmission for several seconds before Dr. Patel's voice returned, more urgent now. "The mathematics are beautiful. Terrifying, but beautiful. This isn't random. This isn't destruction. It's reconstruction. The universe is being reorganized. And we're being quarantined, isolated, protected, preserved, like specimens in a cosmic collection. If anyone receives this, you need to understand, they're not destroying the stars. They're moving them, all of them. The entire universe is being relocated, except for us. We're being left behind. Or maybe we're being saved from whatever they're running from. I can see them now, through the station windows. They're... The transmission cut off. Every attempt to re-establish contact failed. The Oort Cloud Station, humanity's furthest permanent outpost, had joined the growing list of silent sentinels. But they'd sent more than just words. In the final burst of data, the station had transmitted their sensor readings. Eleanor spent 3 days analysing them, barely sleeping, trying to comprehend what she was seeing. The patterns in the data were like nothing in human mathematics. They showed space itself being folded, twisted, rearranged according to rules that seemed to violate every known law of physics. But the more she studied them, the more a terrible sense of recognition grew. "Look at this," she said to Thomas, pointing to a recurring sequence in the data. "It's like cellular mitosis, division, separation, but on a cosmic scale. Are you suggesting the universe itself is dividing?" "Not dividing, being divided, deliberately, systematically." She pulled up a 3-dimensional model based on the data. "These aren't random events. This is a process, a procedure like quarantine protocols." The implications were staggering. Something was systematically isolating their solar system, preserving it while the rest of the universe was being relocated, reconstructed. The words felt inadequate to describe what they were witnessing. That night they received the final transmission from beyond their solar system. It didn't come from any human source. It was a signal unlike anything ever recorded. A complex mathematical sequence that repeated exactly 3 times before falling silent. Dr. Wright spent weeks trying to decode it, working with linguists and mathematicians from around the world. When they finally cracked it, the message was both simple and terrifying. Preserved for study, isolation protocols engaged, universe relocation proceeding as planned, specimen containment active. The next day, the last visible stars began to flicker, like candles in a wind that humanity couldn't feel. The long night was about to begin. It happened on a Tuesday. Dr. Eleanor Wright would always remember that detail. How ordinary the day had started, how mundane it had seemed before everything changed. At exactly 10:24 a.m. Pacific time, every astronomical instrument on Earth registered the same event. The simultaneous disappearance of every star beyond our solar system. Not a gradual fading, not a sequential vanishing, but a precise, coordinated extinction of light. One moment the universe was there, the next it was gone. The sun remained, but even it looked wrong. Its familiar yellow-white radiance had taken on a reddish tinge, as if seen through a filter that shouldn't exist. Spectral analysis showed its atomic composition unchanged. yet something about its light was fundamentally different. Panic erupted globally. Religious leaders proclaimed the end times. Doomsday cults emerged overnight. Governments struggled to maintain order as millions of people took to the streets, either in terror or celebration. The night sky, now completely devoid of stars, seemed to press down on humanity, like a smothering blanket. But in her observatory, Eleanor had made a discovery that chilled her even more than the vanishing stars. She'd found an ancient astronomical record preserved in a monastery in Tibet that described an identical event occurring over 10,000 years ago. The manuscript, written in a script so old it had taken weeks to translate, told of a time when the sky gods took away the lights, leaving only the Daybringer and its children. The account described exactly what they were experiencing now: the reddening of the sun, the disappearance of the stars, and most importantly, the barrier. "Mike," she called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Are you seeing this?" On their monitors, something was forming at the edge of their solar system, a sphere of something. Not darkness, not light, but a kind of membrane that defied description. It started as a barely detectable distortion in space, but within hours it had become visible even to amateur telescopes. The barrier, as it came to be known, encased their entire solar system in a perfect sphere. Its surface was unlike anything humans had ever encountered. Not solid, not liquid, not gas, but something that seemed to exist between states of matter. Dr. Thomas Blackwood's team discovered that the barrier didn't just stop at being a wall in space. It exhibited properties that defied physics. Any probe or signal sent toward it was reflected back, but not in any way they could predict. Sometimes the reflections came back hours before they were sent. Sometimes they returned aged by centuries. Time itself seemed to behave differently near the barrier's surface. Then came the first cases of what would later be called barrier sickness. People who spent too long studying the barrier through telescopes began experiencing strange symptoms. It started with dreams, vivid visions of impossible geometries and vast alien intelligences. Then came the compulsions, the need to write complex mathematical equations they didn't understand, the urge to build strange devices for unknown purposes. Eleanor documented each case meticulously, noticing a pattern in the equations the affected people produced. When compiled together, they formed something coherent. A message, a warning, a blueprint. She couldn't tell, but she knew it was significant. But the most terrifying discovery came from her own calculations. The barrier wasn't just containing them, it was moving them. Their entire solar system was being transported through space, or something like space, at velocities that shouldn't have been possible. They were being relocated. But to where? And more importantly, why? The first direct attempt to study the barrier ended in tragedy. The International Space Agency had retrofitted a fusion-powered probe with every sensor known to science. They launched it towards the closest point of the barrier, near Jupiter's orbit. The entire world watched through the probe's cameras as it approached the shimmering membrane. Dr. Eleanor Wright sat in mission control, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk as the probe drew closer. The barrier's surface seemed to ripple, like heat waves over hot asphalt, but with patterns that hurt the eyes, if watched too long. "Probe approaching barrier perimeter," announced the mission controller. "Distance 1,000 kilometers, 500, 100. The moment of contact was both anticlimactic and horrifying. The probe didn't crash, it didn't explode. It simply reflected. But what came back wasn't the probe they'd sent. The object that returned was identical in every way, except it showed signs of having aged thousands of years in an instant. Its hull was corroded by millions of micro-impacts from particles that didn't exist in our solar system. Its databanks contained recordings of stars and phenomena no human had ever seen. But it was the organic samples aboard that disturbed Eleanor the most. The simple bacteria cultures they'd included in the probe had evolved, not randomly, but with purpose. They'd been changed into something else, something that seemed engineered rather than evolved. "We need to quarantine that probe," she ordered. "Now." Her caution proved prescient. Within hours, the evolved bacteria began exhibiting impossible properties. They could manipulate light, alter local gravity, and seemed to communicate with each other across vast distances instantly. They were quickly contained, but the implications were staggering. The barrier wasn't just a wall, it was a filter, a membrane that could alter anything that touched it at the most fundamental level. But the barrier's most unsettling effect was on human minds, people living near observatories. Those who spent long hours studying it began experiencing synchronized dreams. They reported visions of vast libraries containing the knowledge of civilizations long dead. Some woke speaking languages that had never existed on Earth. Others found themselves solving complex mathematical equations in their sleep. Dr. Thomas Blackwood was one of the first to be affected. Eleanor found him one morning in his office, the walls covered with equations written in his own blood. He was unharmed, but had no memory of writing them. The equations, when analysed, described a five-dimensional space that theoretically existed between universes. Then came the discovery that changed everything. A team of quantum physicists in Geneva detected patterns in the barrier's structure that matched exactly with patterns found in human DNA. The barrier wasn't just containing them, it was studying them, learning, adapting. Eleanor spent weeks analysing data from observatories around the world. The barrier's properties were changing, evolving in response to human attempts to study it. It was like a mirror, reflecting not just matter and energy, but consciousness itself. But the most terrifying discovery came when they realised what was happening to space itself inside the barrier. The laws of physics were subtly changing. Constants that should have been immutable were shifting by microscopic amounts. The barrier wasn't just containing their solar system, it was transforming it. "It's like an incubator," Eleanor explained to a panel of world leaders. "Or maybe a laboratory. We're not just being preserved, we're being modified." As she spoke those words, a new pattern appeared on the barrier's surface, a vast, complex symbol that seemed to write itself across the membrane encasing their world. A message, perhaps, or a label. They were no longer just observing the barrier, they were becoming part of it. 6 months into their isolation, Dr. Eleanor Wright made a discovery that changed their understanding of their situation entirely. She was comparing star charts, or rather, attempting to track what little they could still see through the barrier, when she noticed something impossible. The constellations visible through the barrier didn't match any known star patterns. At first, she assumed it was some effect of the barrier itself, distorting their view of space. But as she dug deeper, a more terrifying explanation emerged. "We're moving," she announced to the emergency scientific council that had been established to study the barrier. "Not just drifting, but being transported at speeds that should be impossible." She brought up a holographic display showing their calculations. The entire solar system, barrier and all, was travelling through space at faster than light velocities. But the physics were all wrong. They weren't experiencing any relativistic effects. No time dilation, no mass increase. It was as if the normal laws of physics simply didn't apply anymore. "But moving where?" asked Dr. Blackwood, who had recovered from his barrier sickness but still occasionally wrote complex equations in his sleep. Eleanor pulled up another display. "That's the thing. According to every calculation we can make, we're moving towards something massive. So massive it makes a galaxy look like a grain of sand." The timing of their movement wasn't random either. They were accelerating and decelerating in patterns that suggested deliberate control. Whatever was moving them knew exactly where they were going. Then came the incident with time. It started small, atomic clocks falling out of sync near the barrier's edge. But soon the effects became more pronounced. People living in cities closer to the barrier's perimeter experienced time differently than those near Earth's core. Minutes stretched into hours or compressed into seconds. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a quantum physicist working with Eleanor, developed a theory. The barrier isn't just moving us through space, she explained. It's moving us between possibilities, like we're being shifted between layers of reality. The evidence supported her theory. The barrier's surface had begun showing what looked like windows into other versions of their solar system. Glimpses of Earth with 2 moons, Mars with oceans, Jupiter with rings like Saturn's. But these weren't just possibilities, they were iterations. Previous versions of their solar system that had been collected, preserved, and transported just like they were being transported now. Then, they detected the first signals from the entities responsible. It wasn't communication in any traditional sense. Instead, patterns began appearing in the barrier's structure, complex geometrical forms that changed and evolved. Dr. Wright's team discovered that these patterns matched mathematical sequences found in everything from quantum fluctuations to galaxy formation. They were looking at the language of the universe itself. They're not just moving us, Eleanor realized one night, staring at the patterns. They're rebuilding us, optimizing us, like gardeners transplanting a rare specimen to better soil. But it was what they found in the barrier's deep structure that truly terrified them. Hidden in the mathematical patterns were echoes of other civilizations, countless other species that had been collected and transported. Some had survived the process, others hadn't. They were part of a vast experiment, an incomprehensible project being conducted by entities that viewed galaxies as building blocks and solar systems as cells in a cosmic organism, and they were approaching their destination. The discovery came during what should have been a routine analysis of the barrier's quantum structure. Dr. Eleanor Wright and her team had been running tests on the membrane's subatomic properties when they found something embedded in its very fabric: information. Not just random data, but messages. Communications from other civilizations that had been collected before them. The first message they managed to decode was simple but chilling. We were the 13th, you are the 708th. The process cannot be stopped. Adaptation is survival. More messages emerged as they refined their detection methods. They found entire histories preserved in the quantum fluctuations of the barrier. Stories of civilizations that had faced the same isolation, the same transformation, the same journey through impossible space. Some of the accounts were hopeful. Our world was dying when they came. The collection saved us. We evolved. We transcended. You will too. Others were darker. They strip away the unnecessary. Reality is negotiable. Identity is a cage. Prepare for dissolution. Dr. Blackwood worked tirelessly to compile and categorize the messages. A pattern emerged. Not every civilization survived the collection process. Those that resisted the changes, that fought against the transformation, often disappeared from the records entirely. Look at this, Eleanor said one night, pointing to a particularly complex message they'd decoded. This civilization, they learned to manipulate the barrier itself. They found a way to communicate with the collectors. The message described entities so vast and alien that merely attempting to comprehend them drove the writers to madness. These collectors existed in dimensions beyond human understanding, treating galaxies like cells in an enormous organism. But it was the reason for their collection that proved most shocking. Hidden deep in the messages was a warning, repeated across multiple civilizations. They come, the Void Kings, the Entropy Lords, reality frays at their touch. The The collectors preserve what they can before the unmaking. Eleanor spent weeks cross-referencing the accounts. A picture began to emerge. Their solar system hadn't been chosen at random. Something about Earth, about humanity, had made them valuable enough to preserve. "We found references to selection criteria," Mike announced one morning. "Apparently we fit a very specific pattern. Something about our rate of technological advancement, combined with our biological diversity and our..." He paused, double-checking his translations. "Our capacity for adaptation. They chose us because we're particularly good at surviving changes in our environment. But adaptation came with a price. The more they learned about the collector's process, the clearer it became that humanity wouldn't remain unchanged. The barrier wasn't just containing them, it was preparing them. Strange phenomena began occurring across Earth. Children born after the isolation showed unusual abilities: enhanced pattern recognition, intuitive understanding of quantum mechanics, the ability to perceive higher dimensions. They were being modified, enhanced, prepared for something. The question was, prepared for what? The answer came in the form of a new message, not from a previous civilization, but from the collectors themselves. It appeared simultaneously on every computer screen connected to barrier research, adaptation proceeding as planned. Specimen, viability, high, integration phase beginning, prepare for ascension. The transformation of humanity was about to begin. 1 year into their isolation, Dr. Eleanor Wright finally understood why they had been chosen. The revelation came not through the barrier's messages or the collected histories of other civilizations, but through mathematics, pure, undeniable numbers that told a story more terrifying than any warning they'd received. She stood before the Global Scientific Council, her hands steady as she presented her findings. The room was packed with the world's leading minds, all of them showing signs of the changes that had been affecting humanity. The subtle glow in their eyes, the increased neural efficiency that had become common among those studying the barrier. "We weren't chosen just for preservation," she began. "We were chosen because we're part of a larger pattern, a cosmic algorithm that's been running since the beginning of time." Her presentation showed the mathematical relationships between Earth's biology, human consciousness, and the fundamental forces of the universe. They weren't random. Everything about Earth, from the precise composition of its atmosphere to the specific frequency of human brainwaves, formed part of a vast equation. "The collectors aren't just gathering specimens," she continued. "They're gathering components, parts of a larger system, and we were a crucial piece of that system." The evidence was overwhelming. The modifications happening to human biology, the changes in Earth's physical constants, even the subtle alterations in the sun's output, all were part of a precise calibration process. Dr. Blackwood, his hair now streaked with silver from barrier exposure, stood up. "You're saying we're being prepared? For what?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "For integration, the collectors. They're not just preserving life. They're creating something new. A defense against whatever destroyed the original universe. A weapon against the Void Kings." She brought up new data showing the changes in human DNA since the isolation began. The modifications weren't random mutations. They were precise adjustments, creating new neural pathways, new sensory capabilities, new ways of perceiving and interacting with reality itself. "We're being upgraded," she explained, "not just physically, but fundamentally. They're preparing us to become part of a living defense system, a cosmic immune response." The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't just being preserved, they were being transformed into guardians, protectors of whatever new reality the collectors were creating. But it was what they found in the barrier's deep structure that revealed the true scope of the project. Hidden in its quantum patterns was a blueprint, not just for a new universe, but for a new kind of existence entirely. one where consciousness and reality were intertwined, where thought could shape space and time, where the distinction between observer and observed ceased to exist. They were being prepared to become something more than human, something that could stand against the entropy lords, the void kings, the destroyers of realities. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, a 6-year-old girl born after the isolation who drew pictures of impossible geometries and spoke in equations that made quantum physicists weep. She described what they would become. "We're going to be the new stars," she said, her eyes reflecting patterns from higher dimensions. "But not like the old ones. We'll be alive, aware. We'll light up the new sky with thoughts instead of fire." The transformation had already begun. The only question was, were they ready for what they would become? The transformation began with the children. Those born after the isolation showed abilities that defied traditional human limitations. They could perceive quantum states directly, communicate through thought, and manipulate local space-time with their minds. But these weren't supernatural powers. They were evolutionary adaptations, engineered by the collectors through subtle manipulations of reality itself. Dr. Eleanor Wright documented each change meticulously, even as she felt herself changing too. The barrier's influence had begun affecting everyone, though adults changed more slowly than children. Her own consciousness had expanded, allowing her to perceive aspects of reality that had always been there, but had remained invisible to human senses. "The barrier isn't just a wall," she explained to what remained of the scientific council. Many of its members had evolved beyond the need for physical meetings, their consciousness existing in a state between matter and energy. It's a cocoon. We're not just being moved, we're metamorphosing. The process accelerated as they approached their destination. The solar system itself began to change. Planets shifted their orbits into new, more harmonious patterns. The sun's light took on qualities that defied spectral analysis. Reality became more flexible. Then came the day when the first humans began to transcend. It started with Dr. Thomas Blackwood. During a routine barrier analysis, his physical form simply dissolved. But he didn't die. His consciousness expanded, merging with the barrier itself. Through him, they could finally understand what they were becoming. "We're not being preserved," his thoughts echoed through their enhanced minds. "We're being woven into the fabric of the new universe. We're becoming its foundation stones." The collectors had chosen humanity for their unique combination of traits: adaptability, creativity, resilience, and most importantly, their capacity for both individual consciousness and collective action. These qualities made humans perfect candidates for what they would become, living nodes in a vast cosmic network, a conscious universe that could defend itself against the Void Kings. More transformations followed. Children led the way, their young minds easily adapting to their new state of existence. Adults followed more slowly, each transformation unique, but leading to the same result: a new form of consciousness that existed as both wave and particle, both individual and collective. Eleanor was among the last to transform. She held onto her physical form long enough to record humanity's final moments in their original state. Her last written words captured the magnitude of what they were becoming. "We aren't ending, we're expanding, becoming something that our original forms could never have imagined. The stars didn't disappear, we're becoming the new stars, living constellations in a conscious cosmos. Our thoughts will light the way for the next universe. Our awareness will be its immune system, our collective consciousness, its defense against the void." The transformation completed on a Tuesday, just like the day the stars had disappeared. Earth, along with the rest of the solar system, phased into its new state of existence. The barrier dissolved, no longer needed, as humanity took their place as fundamental forces in the new reality. They became living galaxies, conscious nebulae, thinking stars. Each human consciousness became a node in an infinite network of awareness, maintaining the structure of the new universe through thought alone. They were no longer merely observers of cosmic events, they were the events themselves. And in this new state, they finally understood the true nature of the collectors, the Void Kings, and reality itself. They weren't just part of the universe anymore. They were the universe, aware and alive and ready to defend itself against the encroaching void. The story of humanity didn't end. It transformed into something greater, a living cosmos, where every point of light in the new sky was a conscious being, every galaxy a collective mind, every quantum fluctuation a thought. They had been banished by the old universe only to become the foundation of the new one. Not an ending, but a transcendence. Not a death, but an awakening. And somewhere, in a dimension beyond human comprehension, the collectors moved on, searching for the next species worthy of transformation, leaving the newly awakened cosmic consciousness of humanity to guard their sector of the new reality, eternal sentinels against the approaching void.